I think a good podcast is a show that has a unique value proposition that honors the listener in terms of editing and production.
All right. Our guest today has been podcasting for quite a while now. We'll get into that a little bit more. He's most known for his show called Creative Elements, where he interviews top creators and breaks down their processes, their journeys. He also led community for Pat Flynn, so a lot to dig into there. Today, he's going to share his processes for creating a great podcast, from things like ideation to creation to distribution. So we're excited to welcome Jay Clouse onto the show. And my first question to hit things off right off the bat is, what is the first podcast episode you actually remember recording?
Whoa. Well, before there was Creative Elements, there was a podcast called Upside that I was co-hosting with a friend of mine. We started that in 2018, launched in May of 2018. I think actually we began recording in January maybe. And we did like a test run interview with a friend of mine, and it was bad. You just, especially having co-hosts, both of which have never been on the mics before, like it takes a while to learn chemistry and read certain cues about when to jump in versus not. So that interview never aired, but we also knew going into it probably wouldn't. So it was fine.
I love it. Well, back then, what were your notions of what a good podcast was back then?
I think at the time, the first podcast that I ever listened to that got me into it was the Tim Ferriss Show. And then shortly after that, I was listening to You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes and WTF with Mark Maron. So my thought about podcasts were that they were super long and they were low production and that there wasn't a whole lot of planning that went into them. So I thought it was very much like you get on and you riff, and sometimes you have a guest. And if you do have a guest, you're talking for like 2 hours, which is a very particular type of show. There's a lot of those. But little did I know that I was listening to like some of the biggest, most popular shows that can get away with doing that type of show. And so we try to do that. That show Upside, it was 90 minutes out of the gate. Every episode is 90 minutes. And the feedback we got was like, it's too long. And we're like, you're too short. And then we realized, you know what? It was too long.
Yeah, for sure. And you never know with podcasting or any other content, you just have absolutely no idea what you're doing until you really start it, even if you think you understand these channels. So I'm guessing this is probably a dumb question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm guessing your answer has changed since then of what you think a good podcast is.
Totally. Now I think a good podcast is a show that has a unique value proposition that honors the listener in terms of editing and production. Basically just like in terms of the time you're asking the listener to spend, that should be time that the listener is glad they're spending, like every minute of it, maybe even every second of it. Like I said, a unique value proposition. That's pretty much it. I would say that's what I think a good podcast is. Unique value proposition honors the listener. I'm not going to be prescriptive about the length of time or say it has to be super high production. If you're an incredible interviewer and you guide an incredible conversation and you don't need to do much editing or post-production, awesome. I do think you need to have good audio equipment because this is an audio medium. But yeah, I think those are the 3 pillars.
So for Creative Elements, when you were just starting that out, walk us through what the value prop was that you were thinking of and how did you kind of determine that niche or who you're going to be targeting?
I don't know that I had these things thought through when I started the show, to be completely candid. Now, the value proposition is I'm talking to some of the best creators in the world, identifying what is working for them today, so that I can inspire new creators and also give some very tactical, like real world application right now. At the time though, I was thinking about it as I love audio. I want to do something in the audio realm that allows me to take advantage of some of the relationships that I had built with creators to that point, because I had access to some incredible people and no reason for them to collaborate with me. Like we had nothing, I had no reason to reach out to them or do anything. And I was like, this solves that problem. And it creates something fun and cool So I'm going to do that. But I've really sharpened that value proposition over time. I've come to just embrace the fact that, yeah, the job of this show is to give access to some of these high profile creators to go behind the scenes of their business. Because a lot of the times the people I have on the show are basically professional interviewees, but usually they're talking about their work. The example I use a lot is James Clear. He was episode number 2 of Creative Elements. He's done a ton of podcasts, and in just about every one of them, he's talking about how to form good habits and eliminate bad ones, which is great. Super useful, super great content. I want to talk about, how did you get to make a living as a writer? How did you get to spend 5 years writing this seminal book that can now probably fund your entire life? Tell me about how that works and how other people who want to be professional writers can do that. And that's a different value proposition, because most people talking to these creators, again, are talking about their work itself and not the journey to being a professional creator.
When you were also just starting it out, what did you see as like the best case scenario for Creative Elements? What were you just hoping and praying would happen as a result of doing that podcast?
Well, I thought that it would be an audience builder. I thought, this is what's going to bring new people into my world. It's going to be the best product that I create. And this is going to be, kind of an entryway to Jay and his work. And that's changed over time as well. But I honestly didn't have huge aspirations or huge expectations. I did explicitly want to make money from doing it. Like, I wanted it to be a revenue generating asset that was a key part of my overall business. But I didn't have numbers in mind. I didn't have, some master plan. It was like, I'm going to commit to doing this because I like the audio space. This gives me an opportunity to talk to people that I really want to talk to. And I know it's going to fit in with the overall content business that I'm building.
And so you mentioned monetization. That was definitely a goal. There's nothing wrong with that at all. A lot of people listening to this podcast right now that want to do this for themselves and monetize, obviously, because people want to make a living off what they do and what they love. For you right now with Creative Elements, what does the business model look like for it now? Is it just sponsorships, or is there more to it?
Most part, it's just sponsorships. I mean, we sell through our inventory pretty reliably. And so that's good. That brings in good revenue to not just cover my costs, but to fund other parts of the business. I do also reserve some ad inventory for internal promotion. Like, I launched a membership a couple months ago called the Creative Companion Club. And that is the biggest product that I offer and that I sell. And so I run a 45-second spot in every episode to say, hey, launch this community. It's built on Circle, which is one of our sponsors. People love it. If you enjoy this show and you're trying to be a professional creator, you should check out the link, joinccc.com. And I've had multiple members join who told me they joined because of the podcast, which is great. And so that's kind of a secondary revenue model for the show.
When did you start monetizing? How far into the show is that?
So the show launched in March of 2020. And if we recall, March of 2020, interesting time. So we actually had some sponsors, so I won't name on air, but we had some sponsors on board going into March who pulled out because immediately there's this uncertainty. Sponsorship across the board in podcasting around March 2020 just went on pause in a lot of places, especially for a show that didn't exist yet. So we could have, in any other time in history, probably monetize that from the get-go. But I think it was 5 or 6 months later that the first paid campaign went into the show.
Got it. So this is like end goal stuff, monetizing, making a living off of it. There's a lot that goes into actually building this thing so that it's worth that. I want to dive into those things today. I want to talk about coming up with ideas. I want to talk about actually creating this. I want to talk about distributing the podcast so that it can actually grow. Let's start with, let's just treat those as separate buckets, dive more into ideation, and then we'll move on from there if that sounds like a plan to you.
Sure.
On the idea front, first and foremost, how do you reliably come up with new ideas for the current podcast, or do you even need to?
I kind of do. Like, I don't want to cover the same ground a whole lot of times, but I do tend to think about things in terms of who are interesting, up and coming, or early on in the growth curve creators that my audience wants to hear from. and what is the angle that I'm going to take with this episode? Because I spend 45 to 50 minutes of recorded time with each guest, and you can only cover so much ground in that. So even though most of the creators that come on the show, they have like pretty complicated multi-revenue stream businesses, and they could talk about any function of that, I choose a particular angle for each guest that comes on. But it does start with the guest usually. Sometimes it will start with the topic. For example, episode number 88 of the show, I talked to Tori Dunlap, who has an amazing TikTok and amazing Instagram called Her First 100K. She helps women become more financially independent, and she blew up on TikTok. I had her on the show. She had this comment that was kind of like a passing comment. She said, "Here, you'll appreciate this. This is kind of crazy. My most viral TikTok had 2 million views. No, it was 4 million views within its first week. And that one TikTok drove 100,000 email subscribers." And I was like, "What?" And she said, "Yeah, because I have this quiz." And I learned that from Jenna Kutcher. And yeah, that one TikTok, 100,000 email subscribers. That got commented on so often from my listeners that I was like, okay, let's go down this rabbit hole. So I started digging more into quizzes and actually found the person who developed the quiz for Jenna Kutcher that did so well, that inspired Tori. And we had an episode about quizzes because I wanted to talk about quizzes, and I found the perfect person for it. So sometimes idea leads and then it's guest, but a lot of times it's guest first.
So for guests that you have in mind, do you have a framework for knowing like, yeah, this is going to work? Or is it just kind of going into it, gut feeling? Do you not know anything?
Well, I don't have like an official threshold of how big or how I measure someone is quote unquote big enough to be on the show. But generally, I'm looking for somebody who has 500,000 followers or more on some channel. And that's sort of flexible. Like if somebody is predominantly email based, they might not have 500,000 subscribers. Or if they are a podcaster, they might not have 500,000 downloads per episode. But that's the type of size I'm looking for, is like pretty big, pretty remarkable. And for that level of creator, like there's going to be something interesting about their story, because this is so aspirational for the listeners that they're going to want to learn, how did they reach those heights, you know? And so my job is to kind of pull that out and deconstruct, well, what was the truth or the insight of their story that is still applicable and something that we can learn from and take and run with, so that it feels accessible to me at 100 followers on Twitter today or something. So most of the time it's carried by the strength of that person's portfolio or like their creative platform. I do have kind of like a semi-secret goal of identifying creators who are earlier on in their growth trajectory. A good example is I had Dickie Bush on the show when he was at like 15,000 Twitter followers. And by the time the show published, like by the time I edited and published the episode, he was at 50,000. And today he's at like 215 or something. So we've had him on the show twice. That episode might not have been interesting to a listener who just saw Dickie's name, because he might not have been big enough yet that he was name recognizable. But that's what's so interesting about people like that, when you're able to kind of see the trajectory and bring them on, because that's actually much more relevant and accessible to the listener because he's closer to their point. You know what I mean? I've had Tim Urban on the show, author of Wait But Why, incredible blog. Huge part of his success was that he was posting his articles to Facebook in 2015. That's not replicable. So it's not that helpful. I'm trying to find the near term, more timely examples of creators who are blowing up right now.
For sure. Yeah, that's one of the big things I've noticed in podcasting is the size of the guest. It does matter to some extent, but if your distribution strategy is solely reliant on a big person sharing it everywhere, it's not enough from what I've seen. And so having the name recognition can definitely help get more clicks, more listens, but sometimes those smaller guests really bring the fire that the bigger guests do not.
Actually, so on that point, that's an important nuance. When I bring on a big guest, I have no expectation that they're going to help with distribution at all. They will help with plays and shares, because the more people who play, the more people who share it. But it is actually the smaller guests who are on fewer shows, and they look at my back catalog of guest names and they're like, wow, it's kind of crazy that I'm being invited onto this show. And so now they're excited to share it. And actually they drive more people to the show than the bigger names.
Yeah, because it's like ultimate social proof. It means way more to them. Whereas Tim Urban doesn't really need creative elements necessarily, although it's nice to have another thing to add on.
Yeah.
But like a smaller person comes on, they're like, dude, I did creative elements.
Yeah.
That's a huge deal.
A lot of the creators I bring on here, like, we both know that I'm not moving the needle for their business. In some ways, they're giving back and they know that, but they at least want to give back on a platform that they know is going to reach people. But, if I'm Tim Urban or Seth Godin or James Clear or any of these creators doing interviews all the time for very legitimate platforms, if I was going to share every interview I did, I would have no space in my content calendar for my original content. Like, it would just be, hey, I was on this and I was on this and I was on this. And a lot of times you're talking about the same stuff. So it's not serving your audience. And they recognize that, and they're very good about putting up boundaries and making choices, curated selections. Or they might have a blanket rule of like, I don't share any of these, because that removes the ask a lot.
You've talked about kind of some of the constraints that you have. They're not super rigid, but there's some constraint there of who might be a good guest, what topics you're going to talk about, things like that. When you have that aligned and you have a person you're kind of zeroing in on to get on the show, what does your outreach process look like?
It's almost always a cold email. Sometimes I'll be able to find a pathway to get an introduction, but I would say if you look at the roster of guests I've had on the show, 90 to 95% have been a cold email. Sometimes we're connected on like Twitter or something and I can send a Twitter direct message. But still, it's like pretty cold. So I have a template email that I send, and it's short because I believe if you're sending a cold email, you need to be able to scroll and read the whole thing with just one flick of your thumb. And you need to be very clear and very direct. So it'll say, hey, name. And then the first paragraph is some way of trying to connect with them and build rapport in a unique way that also shows I'm honoring their time, and that this is not a boilerplate thing. So it'll be like, hey, I just finished listening to your audiobook, The Perennial Seller. And this is one major takeaway that I had. I haven't heard you talk about this a whole lot. I would love to dig into this on my show. And then I'll basically put in bold the pitch. And then I'll say Creative Elements is a show talking to today's top creators about how they made a living with their art and creativity. And I'm trying to talk to people like you who have made that work. It's a high production show on the Podglomerate Podcast Network that has been featured in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Castbox, and a bunch of other players. Would you be open to, and this is in bold also, would you be open to a 45-minute remote interview? If yes, I will send you a scheduling link. Oh, it's a 45-minute remote interview in the next few months. I also leave the window pretty wide. If yes, I'll send you a scheduling link. If not, no worries. Thank you for the consideration. And that's it. And I will hyperlink the show. I'll hyperlink like the Apple Podcasts page when I say the pitch, Creative Elements is. I'll hyperlink that so they can do the research. And I think maybe I also name drop some guests. I say it's a high production show. I've spoken with Seth Godin, James Clear, Tori Dunlap, Cody Sanchez. So I'm like, social proof. Valuing your time. This is specifically sent to you. Also, zero pressure.
Yeah, that's the way to go. That's a good template for everyone here to follow, because I've gotten invites to podcasts where it is like a 3-page novel. I've also gotten ones that are way, way, way too short, and it's like, hey, saw you on Twitter. Will you come on my podcast? I'm like, no. You
got to sell me on it a little bit.
No.
I think actually the most common mistake that I see, and this is like tragic to me, so I'm going to bring it up. It'll be a well-written email, and then they'll say, do you have time in the next couple of weeks? Nobody has time in the next couple of weeks. Any time that I have in the next couple of weeks, I am protecting with my life. I need that time. And if you are reading an email and you're a busy person and you're like, you know what? Yeah, I will do this person a solid. They're making a good effort. They're being like very kind. I'll do this. And then they say, do you have time the next couple of weeks? You have to reply with like, no, I don't. And now you're starting this back and forth and the whole thing becomes not worth it. One, you feel like, you're doing so well. And then you realize, this just isn't worth it. Screw it. I'm not going to answer.
It's a shame.
Yeah. So like leave the window wide. And when you make it wide enough to say in the next couple of months, of course, everybody has time in the next couple of months. So it's a much better hit rate.
Yeah. And they may still, get something on the books for within the next couple of weeks anyway, but they don't feel the pressure necessarily. So once you've like reached out to them and they actually say yes, is there anything for you in your process between that and recording? How much prep work, how much stuff do you send over, or is it more organic?
When they say yes, I'll send them my scheduling link. I use SavvyCal. Love SavvyCal. It has just a couple of questions. It's like, what's your email address? They pick a date. It asks for a phone number in case of emergencies. And then I have an open text field that's optional to say, is there anything else I should know? They schedule it. It goes on my calendar. It goes on their calendar. It kicks off an automation that creates a document in my Notion database, which creates my interview research template, basically. And then, I do research. I read up on them as much as I can. I listen to other interviews. I watch their channel or listen to their podcast or watch their, social media feed and kind of get acquainted with their style. I don't prep them other than the bullets in the email that basically say like, hey, this is going to be recorded in Riverside. We're recording both audio and video. Please, if you have a professional microphone, that's great. Without that, I would prefer corded headphones. If you don't have that, your built-in microphone will be fine. We'll troubleshoot that. That's mostly it. I think there are a couple other points, but actually Riverside had a really great like guest checklist page, and I took a couple things from that. So that's a good starting point. But that's it between scheduling and recording.
Yeah, simple. I like it. The research side, that can get as muddy as you want it to be. So for you, besides just, looking at what they've already done, trying to avoid the same old conversation, which most podcast hosts will not do that. That's why you get the same conversation from those guests all the time. For you, what are you looking for out of that research that basically at the end of it, you leave it feeling like this is done? What are you hoping to get in preparation for that, where it's going to be enough?
Well, I do want to see, amongst other shows in the category, I want to fit my show in to be a little bit different. But there are sometimes some like critical stories that I hear in other shows, like, I've got to get them to talk about that. And maybe I'll take like a slightly different tack or spend less time on it. But sometimes you do hear anecdotes that are like, we want to talk about that. Because also sometimes listen to interviews and the guest will make kind of like an aside that's really interesting and the interview misses it, just doesn't follow up on it. I'm like, okay, I'll bring that in and follow up on that. But I'm basically researching until I feel like, okay, I know the specific angle that I want to take with this interview, and I have more questions than I could possibly ask in an hour. And they're prioritized by how I think the arc of the story should go. And then I'm ready to go. And I can do that a lot more efficiently than I used to. It kind of comes down to choosing the right other interviews if you're using that as a research tactic, which I really like to do. And it doesn't take a whole lot of time anymore. I wish I had more time to do research. I wish I could spend like days researching for each guest, but that's difficult to do.
Moving on to kind of the creation bucket here, I think we've talked through ideation, outreach. We've gotten into some of your tool stacks, so we're getting into this creation side of it. When you're interviewing and a guest is just not pulling their weight, what do you do as a host in those moments? Are you the type to just shut it down and be honest about it? Do you try to carry it? Like, what's your method?
It's only happened like twice. Because again, most of the people that I have on the show, they are performers in a sense, so I have kind of a leg up in that way. But I have had a couple folks who I think they weren't as experienced with doing interviews, and they would be like super concise, super brief. That's usually what happens, is they'll just like answer something super briefly. And the nice thing is you can ask more questions in those interviews than any other interview. But what I try to do, if that's happening and I can't get them to kind of keep going, I will just parry that with like brief follow-ups. Like they'll say something, I'll say, why? Or because. Like super brief to get them to keep going, or just sit in like uncomfortable silence. Because sometimes they'll respond with like one or two sentences, and I'll just kind of like wait an extra beat and look at them. And then often they'll kind of follow up. Sometimes people are trying to be like really respectful actually, and they don't want to go on and on and on. The best guests that come on are like really good at being concise and using anecdotes. And they will actually give me signals like, do you want me to keep going? And I can be like, I can just basically nod or be like, yeah, keep going. Or they'll literally say, do you want me to keep going? And I'll say, please. That's really great. But sometimes people just do cut short. And then I try to just pull more out. Instead of just jumping to the next question, which is probably going to get more short responses, I'll try to dig in more to whatever the short answer they gave was.
There's the flip side of that too. If they're too verbose, that can be a problem that requires you to be a little bit more interrupty.
Totally.
Do you find that happens at all? How comfortable are you with interrupting people and steering it back in a different direction?
Yeah, this is actually one of the reasons why I love that we're on video. And I haven't always recorded video, but I have always recorded with video. And it's really nice because I can kind of give subtle cues. Like I'll move closer to the mic and like open my mouth. like kind of take a breath, like I have something I want to add. And usually they pick up that signal. Or sometimes I'll literally just like raise my hand. I'll be like, hey, and then they'll pause and do that. If I have to talk over them, I will, because these tracks are recorded independently. And so you don't have to have that like talk over awful experience for the listener when you do editing. But I try not to. It's an issue of like, I can cut all kinds of stuff in post-production. I cut stuff all the time, but we run out of time and we don't get to cover all the ground that I want. So I do have to interrupt people. I'll say like, hey, I need to prevent myself from going down this rabbit hole and spending the whole hour here. So to protect myself from myself, I want to change gears and talk about this. And then we'll move in that direction.
You had mentioned the importance of silence, really important in podcasting, being okay with silence, interrupting sometimes, but like, I think the way that you've kind of navigated steering the conversation a different way is probably an appropriate way to do this. Are there any other underrated things in podcasting, like during the mid interview, that you really lean on? Are there any other tactics, anything else you do that you think is actually really important that most podcasters kind of fail at?
Yeah. I picked this technique up. I don't remember if it was Larry King or Charlie Rose. I think it was Charlie Rose. And I kind of just mentioned it, which is one of the quickest interruptions you can give to guide the conversation is the word because. And a lot of times people who are talking about something, they'll say something that you want to follow up on, but then they move past it because they think it's not interesting or important. Whereas if you're really listening and you're engaged in that moment and they say, yeah, I mean, last year I had the worst year of my business, you can say, because. And then they're like, oh, because of this. You know, you can clarify in real time without being too interruptive and just kind of guide the conversation. So that's one tactic that I lean on. I think that, I mean, I do a lot of research and I come up with a lot of questions, but I'm not married to those questions. Actually, the research is more so priming my brain because I will remember those questions, not verbatim necessarily, but as conversation is happening and I'm listening to the guest, organically, I will understand when a question I had wanted to ask it's time. You know, it's okay. This is a good segue. I'll move into that. It's really a hard skill to learn, to not be like looking at your notes or really married to the questions that you have in the order that you have them. But it's a much better listener experience if you are listening to the guest and flowing natural conversation and taking those routes when you can. But it just takes practice. Other things, though, I think people fail at. Here's one more interesting thing. So I have transcripts made of my episodes. I use a tool called Otter, mostly to help me in the post-production. And what that tool will tell me is the percentage of time I'm talking versus the guest. And I'm looking at Otter to make sure that literally 80-20, I'm speaking 20 or less % of the time, and the guest is talking 80% or more. The only time that deviates is if they are like a short answerer. But if I'm talking more than 20% of the time, I know I'm probably not giving the audience what they want. The audience loves you as a host. Don't get it wrong. They listen to you every week. But you don't need to, like, a lot of hosts will respond and put in a lot of their own opinions, and suddenly like they're talking about their thing. And it's kind of pressuring on the guest because they might disagree with you, but you're hosting the space. So if they do disagree with you, they're probably not going to call it out. They'd have to be really confident and understand they're actually doing a service to call it out. Most of the time, if you say something they disagree with, they'll just be like, yeah. And it's not good. It's not helpful to the guest. They want to hear from this person.
It's not interesting either.
Like,
they want controversy.
Yeah. Like, you have such a finite time with this person. Give them the floor and guide them and help pull out the best that you can from them. But you really want to make that episode about them. Oh, one last thing. This is a really important one. One reason people love Creative Elements is the editing. I shared that, I think. But what really that I'm doing is I'm making the first 5 minutes before the interview good. And I do that by pulling in little bits of audio from the interview itself and introducing the guest in such a way that makes them clearly legitimate and interesting. I don't ask the guests to introduce themselves or say what they do or tell a little bit about themselves because they're going to be humble. They're going to be modest. And that's not compelling or interesting to the listener. They want to know, why should I care about listening to this person? You should spell that out. You know why they're interesting. That's why you had them on the show. You should do the work of introducing that guest really, really well, teeing them up as an authority, and spending all the time pulling that wisdom out of them.
I love it. There's so much to dive into there. I want to talk distribution too. I've got one last little thing in the creation bucket here around questions. Because if you're doing an interview style, the quality of the content, point blank, is dependent on the quality of your questions. Your ability to ask and collect great questions as a host is what allows that 80-20 to really succeed, where the guest can go 80% of the time and give you great stuff that whole time. They don't feel like they have nothing to say. So for you, kind of a big question, but how do you go about collecting questions, and what are some key indicators that you've hit on something that's like really good, really usable? It's going to be interesting and different.
I think you need to follow your curiosity a lot. I think you need to trust yourself and your own curiosity, because the audience that you've curated probably thinks like you and wants to know the same things that you want to know. So don't ask questions that you think people would want to know. Ask questions that you want to know. Presume some intelligence from your audience, because you can always go back and record some voiceover or like fill in gaps of like, hey, we're about to talk about this subject. If you've never, or like, let's say that my guest introduces the Dunning-Kruger effect. I don't need them to explain what the Dunning-Kruger effect is, because that takes some of our time. I would rather record voiceover and say, hey, Blake just mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect. If you're not aware, the Dunning-Kruger effect is this psychological phenomenon where people who know very little about something overestimate their knowledge about that thing. And people who know a lot about it underestimate their knowledge because they're much more aware of how much there is to know. And just drop that in. And you can do that in a very concise way that is precise and doesn't require the guest to like know things and know how to say them. So follow your curiosity. Ask what you want to know. Don't spend time on basic subjects that you could research and introduce yourself. And then make sure you're asking open-ended questions. Don't ask yes or no questions, because that doesn't really do much. And if you do ask yes or no, it should be a quick thing. Be like, hey, I get a vibe that you believe we should be reaching out to brands and not waiting for them to reach out to us. Is that true? Yes. Okay, great. So how do I do that? Like, what's the best way for me to do that? You can use yes or no questions to confirm something you think you know, and then use that as a jumping off point for your open-ended question. I like to start questions with the phrase, talk to me about thing, because it's not prescriptive. It doesn't force them down one path or another. It is the more open-ended, like, hey, help me get started with your way of thinking. Because again, most guests are courteous. So if you ask a leading question, they're going to be led, even if they don't necessarily completely agree with it. When you leave it open-ended, like, talk to me about this, you're going to get a more honest response.
Goes back to like what you learn in surveys 101, that type of thing. To just avoid bias, open-ended, all that stuff. It applies to questions too, for podcast episodes. So we're studying. If you're not aware of how to build a really good survey, really good lessons in there for applying this to as a podcast host. Let's switch gears just a tiny bit here. Distribution is honestly probably the thing that most podcasters and ourselves included get questions about, because people are so obsessed with growth and monetization that this is what they want to know, even more than making great interviews, coming up with the best guests and pitching and all that. So for Creative Elements, maybe you just walk me through your distribution strategy a little bit, what channels you use, what channels you avoid,
sure,
all that.
Well, one thing that I did from the beginning of the show was I wanted partners on this side of things. So I actually pitched the show concept to a podcast network because I figured they have relationships, they have a way of thinking about this, they're going to give me a leg up. And they did. I think I had the first episode of the show done in January of 2020, and we released it in March of 2020 because we spent some time building relationships, letting editorial teams know, whether that's a magazine or a blog or even the teams at the listening apps, that the show's coming, and making sure that like the presentation was really good, the artwork was good, the music was good, the audio was good, because you're not going to get featured in these apps and these players if you don't have a very professional looking and sounding show, because it doesn't look good for the app. So that's just like some honest, tough love on that front. But features in those listening apps are huge. They're hard to win. So I don't think you should depend on them. I think you should look at them as an awesome win if you're able to secure them. But you can, pitch blogs. And the underlying idea here is other people's audiences. Leverage other people's existing audiences who are likely to care about your show and try to get in front of them. That might be paying for an ad on that show. That might be doing a cross promotion. That might be doing a guesting swap. That might be any number of ways that make sense to get in front of other people's audiences, because they have already curated the type of person that you want, and you're basically doing an audition for them. That's the best point of distribution. Now, we all know that podcast discovery is challenging in an audio-only medium. There's not a great search engine like Google or YouTube in audio only. So what do you do with that? You create a great product that people can't help but tell their friends about. You live with the fact that there isn't audio discovery. You make a video show. I'm doing that right now with Creative Elements. By the time this airs, that channel will probably exist. Creative Elements will be on video, thanks to Riverside. That puts us on YouTube, where there is natural search discovery, where people are searching for the names of the guests on the show. And that's one method for me doing it. But over the last year or so, what I've been really focusing on is creating my own discovery engine by using my email list, to constantly introduce and reinforce the show. And if I drive more email subscribers, some number of them are going to convert to podcast listeners. And so the game becomes, how do I acquire email subscribers? It's often easier than audio subscribers. And if I'm introducing the show to every one of those new subscribers and some number of them become listeners, we've got growth, baby.
Where's the show at now? At least in terms of the numbers you want to share for growth and monthly stuff.
Sure. So the show gets about 5,000 downloads per episode in a 30-day period. So it equates out to be somewhere around 35,000 downloads per month total. I would like that to be higher. But the positive thing that I'm watching and really concerned with is, are Apple Podcasts and Spotify downloads on a per episode basis increasing month over month? To me, that's like the sign of a healthy, growing show. If those two platforms, which are the biggest podcasting platforms, if they are growing month over month, and not just total downloads, because sometimes total downloads is skewed by the number of episodes you release, average downloads per episode on those platforms, is that growing organically? And if yes, that's good. That's a good metric. That means that you have growth and you have retention.
Definitely. Well, as we come full circle here, I really want to, I like to end with an open-ended question for you. We've talked about ideation. We've talked about creation. We've talked about distribution. Is there anything at the end of all this where you're still like, well, we didn't really cover that and we really should have?
We covered a lot of ground. You did a good job here. Here's one thing that I will put out there. So you asked did I start monetizing the show, and I said 6 months in. But even on day one, I had built into the structure of the show where the different ad spots would be, and was using that inventory for cross promotions and internal promotion, so that literally from day one, people expected ads in these 3 places, the pre-roll and 2 different mid-roll spots. So never did I introduce ads for the first time and people be like, what's going on? They've just always known like, oh, this show, this is the format. It starts with ads, it has ads in the middle. And so there wasn't ever this pushback of like, whoa, why you have ads now? And honestly, I think culturally people have gotten a lot more supportive of the creator, and they recognize like, oh, this is like funding the show and helping this person make the thing. And oh, I have the autonomy to skip them if I want to. It's not that big of an inconvenience. But I do think if you want to monetize a show with ads, I would introduce those ad units as quickly as you can, even if they're not paid spots yet, and do cross promotions of those shows, talk about your products, ask people to sign up to your email list, that type of thing.
I love it. 3 years from now, within the next 3 years, what new things do you think you're going to try for creative elements that you're not doing right now?
Video is a big one, but that's happening very, very soon. And I think that the video show will probably end up dwarfing the audio show in short order, hopefully. In which case, I would love to be doing more on-location live shows. Live podcasts were a thing for a while, and then we had COVID and nothing was really happening. And I think I'll probably be doing that at some point, which would be pretty fun. And it doesn't have to be like a large scale thing. It might be like a behind the scenes tour of some creators like office or studio or day. And it's a small number of people, but I think I'll be doing some on location interviews.
I'd love to see it. Are we going to see Jay Clouse doing TikTok trend dances anytime soon?
I don't know if I'll be doing the trend dances, but the TikTok is alive. The TikTok is here mostly as a mechanism to share clips from the video show. Again, thanks to Riverside. But yeah, TikTok is happening.
I want to see the dance clips, but I understand it. It's not for everybody. I've actually had somebody explain to me recently the TikTok to podcast thing and why it's so effective. And essentially because a podcast is the exact opposite of a TikTok, and that's why it works well, which I found to be pretty interesting. Like, yeah, TikTok is short attention span. You have no time to gather interest. It has to be flashy. And a podcast, people are not usually looking for flashy. They're looking for deep, or they're looking for some connection, and it's quite different. So I thought that was pretty interesting. I think you're on the right track with that as well. We'll see how it evolves over time.
And this might be interesting to you and people listening. I think I told you the reason we didn't do video for so long was because I do so much post-production on the audio and people talk about the editing. I wanted, if there was going to be a video show, I wanted it to be as remarkable. And so the way we're cutting the video episodes of Creative Elements, I want it to feel like you're watching TikTok. It's like we're editing and making the video feel like you're watching a 60-second TikTok, but it's a 60-minute interview. And of course, you got to find the balance where it's not obnoxious. But I'm really excited about it. I think it's pushing the form a little bit for remote interviews, and I think people will really enjoy it.
I love it. If anyone's going to pull it off, it's going to be you. So rooting for you. And hope that works out really well. Again, Jay Clouse, thanks so much for coming on. Check out Creative Elements. If you have not listened to that show yet, it is really high production value, super valuable, a lot of great guests on there. Highly recommend that. Jay, I want to give you just a second here to talk about anything else that's going on, where people can find you online. The platform's yours to basically just share where you're at in life and whatever you want to put out.
Creative Elements is a place. If you're listening to this on audio, just search Creative Elements in your audio player. If you're on YouTube, you can go to youtube.com/creativeelementsfm or search for it. That is the place. And if you want to connect with me personally, you can find me on Twitter @JClouse.
Awesome. Highly recommend the follow. Thanks, Jay, for coming on.
Blake.